Welcome to the Faith and Culture Now podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Shiffer, and today I'm happy to be joined by Jillian Brown and Steve Stanley. Jillian, Steve, good to have you guys.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So, today we're going to be talking about how our Christian faith relates to books we read and movies or TV shows that we watch, plays we go to, concerts, whatever the case is, art that we consume. We're going to talk about how to think about that from a Christian perspective and also just sort of think about or talk about how we think about relating our faith to the things that we enjoy. And so, with that being said, I want to begin by just talking briefly about novels and television shows that have sort of these stories that are designed around building characters. And one of the things that I think we can learn from most characters is either how to or how not to react and do certain things. And this sort of gets into the idea of morality. But every author, every writer has different ideas in mind when they're developing characters. And a lot of times these ideas come with shaping morality for individual characters, but also then looking at how we can learn from that as Christians. And so this is really helpful when you're parenting. You can watch, say, Beauty and the Beast by Disney, and you can look at characters like Gaston, and you can go, look, here's how not to behave yourself. And you can also look at characters like Belle and say, here's how to behave yourself. And so it makes it easy for parenting, but also you can look at how that relates to the Christian faith as well and how it relates to the Christian life and living the Christian life. So I wanted just to begin by asking you, Steve, what are some ways in which you sort of look at opportunities in novels or in shows to allow you to sort of analyze your own faith, but even also to give you opportunities for helping develop Christian character in your kids?
Yeah, I man, this is a great question, Scott. I think for me, I want to look at worldview. What's the worldview behind the story being told? I see a lot of movies, books, music as trying to share some sort of mythological story, and there's a principle behind that story, right? And so I kind of get like my literature analytical hat on and I start to just kind of say, what's the good thing about these characters? What are the bad things about these characters? And then how does that spark a discussion, especially like with my kids when we're watching a movie? We like to kind of talk about afterwards, what did you like about this character? Or what did you dislike about that character? One of the things for me is like with you were just talking about what is it, Belle and Gaston? What's that movie?
Beauty and the Beast, yeah.
Beauty and the Beast. I wanted to say Sleeping Beauty. I'm like, that's not it. I'm not a fan of that movie because not because like I'm just some guy against Disney or whatever, but to me, whenever I watched that movie and when I watched that movie as a kid, what I saw was a lesson being taught that if a woman would just love a man enough and serve him enough, eventually he would change. And so there's this scene at, I don't want to like give this away, but it's an old movie. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is your fault, not mine. But spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, or I guess in the middle of the movie, Beast or Belle walks in and there's this like a rose in a glass and she goes to touch it or something like that. And the Beast comes in. He's upset that she's in his like secretive room or whatever it is. And he kind of hits her and she flies across the room and hits this wardrobe. And I saw this image of spousal abuse as a kid. I don't know how this connected with me, but I saw spousal abuse. And then I saw that the story was teaching that if she would just continue to love this man and be dedicated to him, then eventually the true man, the beautiful man within would come out. And while I think there's a greater conversation there, the lesson that I was getting from Disney was not something that I saw as healthy or beneficial. And so because of that, I was very cautious of letting my daughter specifically watch that movie, and then my son as well. My wife didn't see what I saw, but that was something that I was very cautious about because there are themes that are being taught in these movies and in these stories. And I could have been maybe a little sensitive, but that was something that I picked up, and I wanted to be cautious not to pass that on to my kids. Now that they're, like, older, they've seen it, we've had those conversations, and I just kinda asked them, "What do y'all think about it?" And it really is actually a good conversation starter, to help them kinda work through what do they understand about the world, what do they understand about marriage and how you relate to one another, and then you can kinda bring in the biblical conversation about, how a man loves his wife and how, sacrificially, and you're supposed to give your life for your wife as Christ gave his life for the church and that kinda thing, right? So, I like, looking at stories, movies, books that aren't explicitly Christian because I think it allows us to see the world the way that the world sees the world, and then allows us to apply scriptural principles to it. But I'm also cautious not to just bombard my kids or myself with a lot of material from a non-biblical worldview if it's not balanced by scripture.
Mhm. That makes sense. Kind of going along those lines, I think, as parents, we tend to need to be the gatekeepers of what they have access to. And so what I've typically said is, we're trying to help raise our children to be responsible adults. And part of doing that is keeping them kids when they need to be kids, but as they age, introducing them to things in the appropriate way at the appropriate time. So, I know Christian parents who are like, nothing above PG-13 is ever allowed in our house, period, and for the kids, it's rated G, not even PG for, until they're, teenagers or whatever. And I go, well, you don't want to be too restrictive with all of that because at the same time, they need to be able to have meaningful discussions with their classmates and the people that are around at school. Of course, I mean, that's assuming you're going to, public school or whatever. You know, you want to sort of you want to guide you guide your children appropriately towards that responsible adulthood. And so something that I wouldn't necessarily let my 7-year-old watch, I might let my 13-year-old watch. And something I might not let my 13-year-old watch, I might let my 16-year-old watch. And you could say the same for books. I mean, you want to have your children reading books that are sort of age appropriate, but then, as they get older, books are going to deal with more concepts and more topics that are probably not so appropriate for your 5-year-old, but maybe appropriate for your 15-year-old. And it is important to sort of see that that's balanced out with biblical discussion and whatnot. But at the same time, um, I also think it's good to hear things from different perspectives, right? So a few years ago, Johnny Cash did this album. Well, a lot of years ago now. He's been gone a while, but he did this album called American Four. And in the liner notes of that album, he said, I like this album because every song takes you in a different perspective. And so you'll see a song with a guy who's convicted of murder and he's very angry about it and feels unjustified and feels like it was okay that he did what he did. And then you'll hear another song where the guy is very much like, hey, I'm going to jail and I deserve what I'm getting. And uh, not that every song on the album deals with going to jail and murder, but with Johnny Cash, that's pretty much a big theme throughout a lot of his music. One of the things I liked about that album, though, is that you find people who are very repentant and then people who are very non repentant. And then, in each different song, Johnny Cash sort of embodies a different character who's dealing with different issues in life and taking it from a different perspective. And I like it just because each song makes you think differently about a different situation. And in the same way, when you're looking at novels or movies or TV shows, you know, you should never turn off your brain while you're engaged in art. Art is not meant to be an escape. I mean, to some extent, it's for entertainment, but it's important to turn your brain on when you're reading or when you're watching something because every artist has a message, and that message is coming through their worldview, as you said, Steve, is coming through in the art that they create. And so, I think it's great to see things from different perspectives because it gives you an understanding of how different people see the world. And that helps you relate to others and it helps you engage in the world better as a Christian. Jillian, what are some of your experiences with this?
Yeah, and I think knowing yourself individually and knowing your children individually is probably the most helpful I guess, advice I would give. So, for instance, I have two sons. One of them is far more sensitive than the other one, and it happens to be the older one. And so the younger brother actually can handle things about the same time that the older one can because he's just not affected by, particularly, I'm speaking about movies. And so I think that's true, as in all cases, in all things in the Christian walk. You have to know the things that are too far for you as a person. And especially when it comes to
Yeah.
themes, when we're talking about what the ratings, PG-13 versus R. I mean, I find that Common Sense Media, I've always gone to those parental guides before I took my kids to something new that I hadn't seen. If I didn't have the opportunity to watch it beforehand, and usually I don't, I'll read those comments. And what's really fun is to read the comments that the kids write. If you've ever gone and done that, really interesting to see how different kids respond to what's happening in those films. Some really insightful young people, actually. And so that's been really a helpful guide, I think, because one story, when I was in 8th grade, I was invited to a Halloween party. And without knowing what would be happening at the party, they decided to show us The Exorcist.
Wow.
My parents were not aware, and I didn't really understand what that film was. When I tell you that messed me up for a while. So it is important. It's important to ask questions when your kids are going places, what's going to be, you know, talked about, watched, and so that affected me so much that I just never wanted to have anything to do with any version of a horror film ever again. And I'm not saying that there's maybe not a place sometimes to have a conversation. I've listened to some very interesting podcasts about people who talk about that, like confronting the themes of evil and good, and that, and a lot of times, and in that movie itself, where did they go? They went to the church for the salvation and for the rescue. And so that's not a terrible theme, but man, I never want my kids to watch that film. But there's people who aren't affected by it. And that's my point. Is I had plenty of friends that it didn't bother them at all. And so I think you have to know your limits in what crosses the line to, this is no longer me exposing myself to art. It is affecting me internally, spiritually, mentally. And that goes for books as well. I think that it is important to read widely, as you guys have been, saying as well. You need to, and I think it's important as Christians to be aware of what people are consuming in the mainstream. The Taylor Swift thing has been a major theme recently. And because I teach young people, primarily I teach them choir and I teach voice lessons, this is constantly something that I'm dealing with. What's appropriate for kids? What's not? Unfortunately, there's not a lot that is being written right now in pop music that I can hand a 5th grader. And so,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I had a conversation with my students, again, because I teach in an area that most of my students are Christians professing. And we sang a Taylor Swift song on our concert called Long Live. Perfectly appropriate. Didn't have anything negative about it. It was very meaningful to the theme of our concert. It was kind of our 8th grade send-off song. And I had some kids, saying, I don't want to sing this because I don't like her. And my response was, well, if you have to agree fundamentally with everything an artist says, does, how they live their life, you're not going to sing anything ever. Because then that goes for Christian artists as well. There's plenty of wonderful music that I love, and I do not agree with most of the life choices of that person. So, I mean, this is getting more into the artist, the creator, rather than the creation. How do we handle that? And that's important. I'm sure we all grew up in the age of burning CDs and things like that. And I was trying to explain that to my son this morning. He was like, "What are you talking about?" And so now it's more complicated because it's all streamable. And so you can't burn, I guess you can get rid of the apps. But I mean, I'm interested to know what you guys think about that. And particularly with music, because it's more easily accessible. It's everywhere. It's on every streaming app you can find. How do you go about putting limits on, or do we, with our kids, what they're listening to? Because that's a far more difficult task now than it was when we were growing up in the age of cassettes and CDs that
Oh
could
yeah.
be thrown away.
I was elated when my 14-year-old turned 14 last month because she wanted more than anything a record player. Not a CD player, not a tape player, a record player, vinyl, for her birthday. Music is my favorite form of art, and so I listen to all kinds of stuff, very, very eclectic, and I want my kids to be, somewhat eclectic in what they listen to, but you're absolutely right. There's not a lot out there new that is made specifically for younger ears. And I think that a lot of older stuff wasn't really made explicitly or specifically for younger ears either. It just happened to be more easily appropriate for younger ears. And you can find songs from the 1930s that make some of the stuff today look tame. And so it's not like music in the whole is, well, it's not like in general there was never inappropriate stuff, but it seems that as our culture has shifted and changed, especially with curse words, where curse words are not really as powerful or seen as big of a deal as they used to be, you find more and more cursing in art today. And you find it in country music and in pop music and in rock music. It's not like, oh, it's just this one genre. In 1992, it was like, yeah, the hip hop guys curse a lot, and that's about it. But really, it's just all over the place now. And so, one of the records that my daughter wanted was the new Olivia Rodriguez record. I was like, yeah, we're not going to get you that record right now. And I know she's heard the songs. I know she's aware of that. There's a fair amount of, and honestly, that's the big thing for me with Olivia Rodriguez is there's a lot of foul language in her records. Now, if my daughter was say 18, I might go, okay, yeah, get it, listen to it, and talk about it. But it's again knowing your kids and knowing how much they can handle, what they're going to analyze, and how they're going to understand what's being said and what the message is. And so I told her no on the newest Olivia Rodrigo album, but I let her get the one previous for vinyl because it's not perfectly clean, but it's not as unclean, if you will, as the newest one. But you could make the same argument for Taylor Swift's newest album. As far as language is concerned, it has more um, foul language than her previous records have. Again, it's just a matter of age and time and ability to analyze and think through what's being said. So it's not that I think, Taylor Swift wrongly put these words on her album. It's that, my 14-year-old really isn't ready for all of that, but, or at least shouldn't be listening to all of that repetitively over and over again. And so, and kind of like what you were saying, Jillian, with regard to age, my oldest is very sensitive and she really gets invested in what we're watching. My 14-year-old, not so much. I mean, half the time she's like, "What's that character's name again?" So she can watch something and somebody dies in a horrific way or something, it's probably not going to affect her. But my oldest, somebody I mean, the amount of times I look over and she's got tears in her eyes from, whatever you're watching. And, there's just very two different personalities. And so you do have to sort of take that into consideration with, as a parent, helping your kids sift through art and different things like that. Um, but again, going back to what you said, Jillian, knowing your kids and knowing what they can handle is a big part of that. And then as a parent, going, well, what should they have to handle? Uh, my 10-year-old could handle some stuff that I think that I would let my 15-year-old, 16-year-old watch, but I'm not ready for her to watch that yet because I don't want her to lose certain levels of innocence and I don't want her to move out of certain childhood things quite so quickly. And it's not and places like Common Sense Media, I think are very helpful. Plugged In is very helpful. I don't always agree with everything they assess. So I wouldn't say wholeheartedly, yeah, whatever they say, that's good, that goes, that's the standard. What I would say is look at what they have to say, especially when you're watching something that you've never seen before, so that you can get an idea of what you're walking into. And from that, you can say, okay, you know what? I'm going to wait till this comes out on video and I'm going to check it out before I let my kids watch it. Or you say, okay, knowing what's in here, I'm prepared to talk to my kids about this as we go through it. But it's sort of a correlation with here's what they say, here's how I know my children. You know, if common media says we think this is for 16 years old and up only, that's great. I may feel like it's okay for a 12-year-old depending on that particular, 12-year-old and what they see, what they hear. I will say, my kids will say things like, Dad, you don't want us to do this, but we hear about this every day at school. And so they're like, maybe we should just watch it and talk about it. And sometimes they win the argument, sometimes they don't, depending on how I feel as a parent about that particular piece of art. Sometimes it's, well, yes, a lot of kids at school do watch this. You don't need to watch this. And I don't think you should probably be watching it as a Christian. I don't think as Christians we should be engaging in this. Or other times I'm going, hey, you know what? We should watch this. We should talk about it. But it's being willing to have those discussions, have those conversations with the kids as you go through it. Um, and not just, all right, you can go watch it and I'm not going to give you any feedback and we're not going to actually discuss it. And I'm not going to be a part of watching it with you. That would be, I think, a very different approach. Steve, how have you, you guys have several kids at several different ages. Jillian, you guys do as well. But um, how are some ways you have determined, sort of what's okay for one versus not okay for another?
Yeah, I mean, the scriptures tell us that we are to raise the child in the way that they should go so that when they're older they won't depart from it. If you are doing a study on the actual Hebrew words, what you'll find is it's not specifically saying there's a generic way for each child to go. And so train them on that one path that everybody is supposed to be on. And so that when they're older, they won't depart from that one path. What the author is actually saying is that you as a parent are responsible to learn your individual child and find out the way that God has designed for them, created them to be. What's that pathway for them specifically, and raise them in that pathway? And so there's a large responsibility for us as parents. And I think, Jillian, you really exemplify this with your kids of understanding what is each of my children, what can they handle, right? What are the things that they like? I've found with my son, he doesn't like team sports, right? And so for me to continue to put him into team sports, he's just miserable. Now I could come and do what a lot of like sports dads do and just, well, he needs to learn how to be a team player, right? He's going to learn life skills. That's true. But I can also find other ways for him to learn life skills to be a team player. One of the things he loves is art and acting and painting and drawing, and he writes his own comic books and developing characters and developing worlds, and I see within that, I see him exemplifying our creator, right? He is created as a creator. And so if I put him in team sports and force him into that world, he's going to be miserable. Whereas if I put him in environments that help him develop as a creator, as an artist, thinking creatively, that's going to help him grow in the path that I believe God has designed him to be. I also am cautious to teach my kids to not accept this sacred versus secular dualism, because that buckets the world in these weird ways of, I call it like testament theology. If you go with me on this, whenever I was younger, I'd go to Mardel's, and at the cash register they would have these mints called testaments, right? And they're like Altoids with like Christian verses on it. And it's such a weird, I think it's supposed to be tongue in cheek and silly, right? But it's this great example of how we as Christians like to bucket things as, well, this is the Christian stuff and this is the non-Christian stuff, right? This is the sacred, this is the secular. So, and apologize if I'm stepping on your toes, but it's like this. Like, do you like Run DMC? Well, we have DC Talk. Do you like Alanis Morissette? We have Rebecca St. James. Do you like Motley Crue? We have Striper, right? And we just have these weird things where we bucket things in. If it's got a cross on it, it's Christian, right? Or I don't have this, but I have a Mazda Miata and I put a Christian fish on the back of it. So now it's a Christian car, right? It's like, no, dude, you're going to the same gas station I'm going to. It's the set, and so when we are breaking apart our world from sacred and secular, our kids don't get a full understanding of this world, how dynamic it is, and how God's created it, how we're to operate within the world. And so I have shown my kids Metallica songs, and you guys are going to be like, "What? Metallica? They're horrible." But what's hilarious about Metallica is they get this weird rap that they're these Satanists or whatever. If you listen to the lyrics of a Metallica song, most of the time they're talking about the dangers of drug addiction, alcohol addiction, PTSD. The song "One" from the Black Album is all about PTSD and what happens in war whenever soldiers come home. The song "Master of Puppets" talks about how when you're in drug addiction, you are obeying the master drug, right? You are no longer in control of your capacities because that drug is now your master. And what do you want to be your master? It's hilarious to me how Christians are like, no, that's so bad. Now, am I going to show my 5-year-old kid Master of Puppets? No, these are themes that they're just not ready for, right? And so I need to know my kid well enough, but I could go back and show my kids some DC Talk songs, and that's cool and that's good if that's what you like. My wife loves DC Talk, so I'm not talking trash about them, but my kids are gonna tune out because that's like 90s rap, rock, whatever it is, right? It's like 90s stuff they could not care less about. But I can pull up a song from, a modern band and listen through it with them and let that be a conversation starter, recognizing that it doesn't have to be a Christian artist that's bringing biblical truth, that's bringing God's truth to us. And I think so. Long way to answer your question. Whenever I'm engaging with my kids, I try to set aside this weird sacred versus secular testament theology and just say, what's an example, an illustration of God's truth that is going to resonate with my kids in a way that they're going to understand something about the world instead of having to go to some 90s rock band, Christian testament type of music that's going to be probably not connect with my kids in a way it's outdated, right? And these are kind of things that I'm thinking through.
Yeah. For the record, my older kids have also heard the song Master of Puppets, along with a number of songs from other artists that I enjoy, like Rob Zombie. So anyway, but I think that it's, to your point, sometimes artists get a bad rap when that doesn't even really fit what they're typically doing. I mean, Megadeth, almost every single song Megadeth sings is some kind of commentary on what's happening across the political spectrum. You know, um, and they deal with issues of homelessness, and they deal with issues of drug addiction, and they deal with issues of not being able to trust the government because of this or that they've done. And also, the PTSD type stuff and war. War is a big theme throughout a lot of their music. And, so for some that may not know, the lead singer of Megadeth was the original guitar player for Metallica. He was fired because he was having some issues with alcohol, and he kind of got himself cleaned up. And actually, now my understanding is that if you are part of Megadeth, you are required to wear button-up shirts for your concerts. That he doesn't let you wear T-shirts. I mean, which is weird to me, but uh,
Well, Dave Mustaine, the lead singer of Megadeth, is also a Christian,
mhm.
like professes to be a Christian, and his lyrics follow that Christian worldview. And it's funny because Christians will be like, no, 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 it has the word death in the name, so that means they're bad, right?
Right, right. There's an Audio Adrenaline song where it's comparing Petra and Megadeth and other stuff, and one of the lines in the song is, "Isn't Megadeth all dead?" Anyway, I think it's funny. But to your point, I do not agree with the secular sacred divide. All truth is God's truth, and anything that is truthful is reflective of the nature and character of God. And as such, all artists have some level of truth in their work, and no artist is perfectly accurate in their portrayal of the truth. Getting into Immanuel Kant, he says there's phenomenal reality and noumenal reality. Phenomenal reality is the world as you experience it. Noumenal reality is the world as it actually is. And nobody sees the world as it actually is because we're all confined to our own experiences. And with that being said, even Christian, Christian with the quotes artists do things that are incorrect sometimes. I mean, you give me 10 Christian CDs, I guarantee you I can find some theological flaws in every single one of them, or at least some debatable issues where Christians aren't unified on that particular point of theology. And in the same way, give me 10 non-Christian CDs, and I guarantee you I can find some things that represent and glorify God in every single one of them. But I can probably also find some things that don't. And, you know, as Christians, we're not really called to separate ourselves from the world. We are to not be characterized by the sinful aspects of the world. But that's different than not living in the world and being part of the world. And so, as we watch shows, as we watch movies, as we read books, as we listen to CDs or records or whatever else, we do so with the understanding that we should be thinking about it from a Christian, from a biblical worldview, and not taking every claim that's made at face value, but saying, is this right? And allowing what's being claimed to be a conversation starter. So, Jillian, what are some additional thoughts you have on some of this?
Yes, I love the conversation about secular versus sacred. And my son and I were talking this morning about kind of along the lines of in the world, but not of it. And we've already mentioned kind of the importance of being able to have conversations, not just our kids, but us too. If we just silo ourselves off to where we're only listening to quote Christian radio, quote Christian artists, read quote Christian books, then we're only going to be having conversations with quote Christians. And I just think that it's important for us to always be able to relate to the world around us. And obviously, there's a part of sanctification that goes along with this, that the further sanctified we are as believers, there's books, music, movies, there are things that I can watch and I can separate myself from being, sucked in or whatever somebody might say watching something, that maybe somebody else can't watch, something like that. So I was talking to a friend earlier today who used to really love rap music. And I specifically asked her preparing for this, what was it about that in your pre-Christian walk and early Christian walk that she very much said that she needed to separate herself from that genre entirely. And now, after having walked her faith a while, she can listen to it and not have the same, if you want to say, kind of sucked in response that all of a sudden those themes are what are all the time playing. And you kind of even said earlier, Scott, about playing on repeat something is very different than just listening to it one time. And so, I do think, especially because I am a musician and repetitiveness is how we learn. Repetition is the key to becoming a better musician, but it's also, it's doing something with us in our neural pathways. And so I do think there is something to say about, as a Christian, there are things you should not listen to, watch, read repetitively. Absolutely. Because none of us are, I don't care how sanctified we are, none of us are immune to the power of that. And, the scripture very clearly says to think on the things above. So I do think, and you said this earlier, Steve, there has to be a balance. There definitely has to be a balance of what we are consuming. But I do still think it's very important, and particularly if you are somebody who is a leader in your church, that you are aware of what it is that people are listening to, what they are watching, what they are reading. My kids' last project for choir actually was to get in groups and write a rap song using slang words appropriately. So there were definitely rules, had to be appropriate. And I had a student say to me, well, there's no way I can write a rap song that's appropriate. And I said, well, that's just not true. So then we pulled up some rap songs that were appropriate and we looked at what is the component of a rap song. We looked at all of these literary devices that are used. And so I think there's kind of like you guys joking about the automatic response to Megadeth, the automatic response to Metallica is often just ignorance. because people don't understand and they don't know. I didn't know any of that you guys just said. That's not the genre that I have listened to ever primarily. And so I didn't know anything about anything you just said until right this minute. So I learned something new today. And I think what's great about what you guys were saying is you were interested in learning about the artist and why they are creating what they create. And so I just think there's a responsibility on the part of a consumer to do a little, and see, now we can do that. We can do that so easily. Now maybe you're not always going to find truth behind, there's so much bad information online. With enough time spent, you can kind of get a hang on what the artist is trying to convey in their music. And then, of course, there's interpretation on the part of the consumer, the same way there is interpretation with scripture. So I just think, yes, be wise, know yourself. If there are certain themes, if there are certain topics, if there are certain genres that are a problem for you, absolutely avoid those. Because
Mhm.
again, what is a problem for one person is not for another. And so that's where I have trouble with us making prescriptions for all people about pretty much anything. Obviously there are some exceptions there, but when it comes to consuming art, I was listening to, so there's a, as I listened to earlier, again, preparing for this, there's a guy out of Vancouver. His name is Josh Porter. Do you guys know this guy? He's a pastor and he wrote a book, and the book is called With All Its Teeth: Sex, Violence, Profanity, and the Death of Christian Art. And it's very much, I'm going to get the book. I want to read it because a lot of the things we were just talking about, he dives into. But even they were talking about on the podcast how, the Sistine Chapel, a lot of the sculptures and a lot of the beauty in these European cathedrals, there have been people that have had problems with some of that forever, for all time, because it was offensive to them.
Mhm.
There are plenty of other people who they stare in wonder at that. And so again, I just think, know thyself, know thy audience, and know your kids for sure. But I do think, and again, this is for me too, I do think ever broadening your spectrum. I think because God is creator, and because, as you've mentioned, every person who is creating is on some level imitating God's image in us, that there is just wonder to be found. And I do think a lot of the time, certainly not on every case, but a lot of the time, you can find something about the truth of God, the story, humanity, something that relates to the biblical text as well. Now, it may be the flip side of it, where you're having to say, oh, look at how this isn't what we should be doing. But in some way, usually you can relate it back. And what a good exercise to challenge. Summer is a big movie time in my house. And so I am encouraged from this conversation. We're probably going to go watch Inside Out tomorrow, and I am encouraged to have a discussion with my kids on the way home. So, yeah, I just think art is important and there is beauty to be found. And we have to be cognizant of what we're looking for and how we are relating it to ourselves and to other people.
Yeah. I was at a church earlier this week that is a beautiful church, and it's got great stained glass windows. But one of the things that someone pointed out to me was that on one side of the church, all of the stained glass windows, each one had a different scientific achievement in the stained glass. And so one of them had a microscope, and one of them had, I think, the Hubble telescope. And um, okay, so one was the Hubble telescope, and each of these stained glass windows also had biblical themes. And the person pointed out to me how interesting it was that this particular church was sort of looking at scientific achievement from a spiritual perspective. And that sort of again flies in the face of this whole sacred secular divide thing. You always hear, well, you can't be like, a scientist and a Christian or whatever. And that's just not true. In the same way, years ago, I was leading a youth retreat. At one point in the retreat, I had an opportunity to have a question answer time with just the high school seniors. And so I was like, ask me whatever theological questions you want to ask. We'll talk about it. And one of the young ladies who was there at the retreat said, "Well, throughout the weekend, I've heard you reference several bands and artists who aren't Christians." And I said, "Yeah, that's pretty normal for me. I do that a lot." And she said, "Well, I just don't understand why you would want to listen to anything that isn't worship music." And I said, "Well, I think there's certainly a place for worship music, especially in the church setting and with the community of believers." I said, "But God is the author of all life. And as such, he is interested intimately in every aspect of human existence. And when you limit yourself to nothing but worship, you're missing out on people reflecting God's image and learning about and understanding all kinds of other issues that are important to humanity. But they're important to humanity because they're also important to the creator of the universe who made us to reflect his image. And as such, it's important to listen to songs about love. It's important to listen to songs about war. It's important to listen to songs about growing up and just the experiences of becoming an adult. These are all important because they're important to who God made us to be as human beings. I don't know if she actually liked my answer or not at the time, but I feel very strongly that you don't want to get too caught up in the secular sacred divide because you miss out on so many important topics and so many important things that God expects us to be involved in because they're part of life, the life that He's created us to live. And
Well, and the Bible itself has the Song of Solomon. There are a variety of art forms present. One thing this guy Josh Porter pointed out was Ezekiel's bizarre street performance that God told him, they're not going to get it, but do it anyway. So, there's so much art in the scripture that we could never confine to a worship song that's written specifically for the church setting. There's just so much in the biblical text that we never get to in the span of a worship song that is also art. And, I think Christine made this point in her post that when we can become a little bit more of like a consumer and critic of art, it actually can help us become even better Bible readers, which I totally agreed with that when she said that.
yeah, for sure. And I mean, even in the Bible, there are chapters dedicated to the art that was to be on all of the walls inside the temple. I mean, we are, well, not all of us are artists. I mean, maybe to some degree, everyone's an artist. Some are better than others, but people who are inclined towards making art, whether it be drawing comic books or whether it be writing fiction or whether it be writing and composing music or whatever, it's all a reflection of being made in God's image. And no one always reflects God's image perfectly because we're in a fallen world. And sometimes we even think we're doing something that's truthful that turns out to not be truthful, but it's part of the learning and growing process. And so ultimately, especially this summer, as you are, having more free time with the kids and they're, you know, my oldest daughter, her plan is I think 2 novels a week this summer to read, and which is great. I won't read any of them, but she will tell me all about all of them, and then I will feel like I have read all of the books with her, but even I mean, my younger girls every night they're like, well, let's can we watch this movie tonight? Oh, this movie's coming out. Can we make plans to watch that when it comes out? And the summer is a big time for all that. And as parents, we can either lock up and get afraid of what's going to be happening, and how do we police all this summer, or we can say, you know what? Let's do some research. Let's make some wise choices. Let's watch some things and talk about some things with our kids. And let's do so in a way that helps shape their character and helps them understand, even from just the perspective of faith and the biblical worldview, what's happening in these stories. But let's do it in a way that we can bring honor and glory to God and also enjoy some really great art at the same time.
Yeah, Scott, I think this conversation just really highlights the importance of intentionality when engaging with whether it's art around us for our purposes or as parents engaging with art intentionally with our kids. It's easy to be a parent who just gives your kid a book, which I love C.S. Lewis, so I'm not knocking him, but it would be easy to give my kids Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and say, go read this off in your room, right? And then now I can have dad time. But I don't think that's really what we're called to do as believers, as parents. I think we're called to be intentional and think through the things that we're consuming, the things that our kids are consuming, and allow those to be a catalyst for a conversation to help further develop our worldview, much like that conversation you had with that student, where the conversation really revealed a categorical misunderstanding of what worship truly is, right? The student is probably thinking like Third Day or
Right.
Phil Wickham, which I love both, right? So it's not a knock on that, but it's a very siloed view of what worship is. Whereas worship is really centering your heart's affection and your mind's attention upon God in all aspects of music or of life. Sorry, not music,
Yeah. Both.
music too.
Yeah.
And when we silo worship into this weird aspect of life to where it's just music, it's just 15 minutes part of my service to set the stage for the pastor to come on stage, what we're doing is we're completely siloing out a worshipful lifestyle that we should be living with all of our life. And so whenever I can see, like last night we watched with my kids, we watched 2 episodes of season 2 of Loki. I know I'm super behind. I'm in a PhD program trying to balance all that. But we watched 2 episodes of Loki season 2, and I will, no spoilers on this one, but I will spoil the Belle and the Beast, Beauty and the Beast. For the Loki, it allowed us the opportunity to talk through, how does God experience time? What happens when we die? Because right now we're living in a timeline, right? And we are experiencing a dimension of God's reality. What happens when we die? And so I see in my kids their wonder and awe sparking, thinking about God's creation and utilizing Loki season 2 episodes 1 and 2 as the illustration for understanding our reality. And what was crazy is to imagine that we're watching this Marvel TV show, which ostensibly has nothing to do with Jesus, and it was a worshipful experience. Why? Because our mind's attention and our heart's affection were upon God and his reality, and where do we fit within that? And I think as we continue to utilize that worldview, we will see our world transformed into a more worshipful reality, while we still try to leverage First Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul is saying, be cautious how you're engaging with the world, right? And if some people have convictions about certain issues, certain things, like Jillian, your friend with rap music, if that's a touchy issue with that person, maybe pump the brakes, right? Hold off on that. But we're not going to demonize it and say it's a horrible thing, never engage with it, but maybe kind of pump the brakes and be cautious. But what I think we're seeing that we as believers engaging in the world cannot be passive. We are called to be active, proactive, intentional. And man, I'm just reminded of Plato, who says oh gosh, I just lost it. What did Plato say? The unimagined life is not worth living.
Oh,
Whatever.
the
Where would
unexamined life.
Plato? The unexamined
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
that's the word. The
Sorry,
unexamined life is not worth living,
I
right?
would have
And
stepped in quicker, but he says so many things, I wasn't really sure which one we're going for.
Plato does say a lot, yeah. But what a biblical uh, concept by a dude who's is not a believer as far as we know, right? So I guess it was probably Socrates who said it. But we should be examining every aspect of our life and finding a way to reconcile it to a biblical worldview, which Paul talks about as well. And there's a great book on it, and I'll be done. But Albert Walters wrote Creation Regained, talking about a lot of these concepts, and he really highlights how we as believers are called to reconcile all aspects of our life to our faith. And we as parents should be doing that not just for us, but intentionally modeling this for our children as well, so that when they grow up, they know how to do the same thing. Instead of just trying to give them the answers, give them a book to read, walk through with them how to think critically about the art they're consuming.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. With regard to, all of this, the idea is engage, be in the world, don't be defined by your own actions by the sinful aspects of the world. Don't be someone who takes advantage of others and is, stingy, with your resources and, whatever, blah, 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 right? But at the same time, if the Holy Spirit's convicted you that you should be not involved with something, then by all means, listen to the Spirit's conviction. But also, don't force those convictions on everyone else. Whenever the Spirit convicts you of something, a lot of times that's a personal conviction and that may not apply across the board. At the same time, if you know someone's been convicted of something, don't try to get them to change that conviction, right? I mean, I think of someone who's like a recovering alcoholic and they've been convicted that they just need to stay away from alcohol. You don't go, "Hey, let's go meet up at the pub and talk about blah blah blah." Like that's not good stewardship on your part. But in all that you do this summer, think about how it relates to your place in the world, your place in creation, and your relationship with God, your relationship with other humans, and analyze everything around you. Analyze the art, analyze your work, analyze your time with family and friends, analyze the way you clean your house, think through all of these things and do so from a biblical perspective, but also knowing that as you do that, it helps you grow closer to the Lord in your relationship and your walk with Him. So, for those of you guys who are listening, thanks so much for your support and for being a part of this podcast. We will see you again next time on Faith and Culture Now.